Hi, first graders. Thank you so much for coming back and listening to the next part of our wonderful Dr. Seuss book, The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. I miss you all so much, and again, I wish you were right here in front of me to hear the book. Are you ready? Okay, let's think back to the first time I read this book. Let's talk about the characters in the story and what problem the main character has. Who are the characters in the story, and who do you think is the main character? Can you turn and tell mom and dad or someone, brother or sister close by, who the main characters are in this story? Yes, you're right. The most important character is Bartholomew Cubbins. And another important character is the king. All right, we are going to meet lots of other interesting characters today. Now think about Bartholomew Cubbins' problem. What is his problem in the story? Can you turn and tell the person next to you? Yes, you are right. Bartholomew Cubbins is in big trouble with the king because he cannot take off his hat. And the king is very, very angry because people a long time ago had to take off their hats to show respect to someone like a king. And every time Bartholomew took off his hat, there was another hat sitting on his head. So let's find out today what's going to happen to Bartholomew when he goes to the castle. And let's find out if he is able to solve his problem. So we are beginning the middle of the story. Yesterday we read the beginning. This is the middle of the story. And it starts out as the captain of the king's own guard is about to pull Bartholomew into the carriage and take him off to the castle. Here we are. This is the captain of the king's own guard. The royal coachman cracked his whip. The king's carriage swung forward up the street toward the palace, but the captain of the king's own guards leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced over the cobblestones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jangling of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street toward the palace. Out of the narrow streets, on up the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher, up the mountain, on past the walls of the noblemen's castles. Flop. The sharp wind whisked off Bartholomew's hat. Flop, flop. Two more flew off. Flop, flop, flop. Flew another and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped, through the great gates and into the courtyard. The captain pulled in his reins. "His Majesty waits in the throne room," said a guard, saluting the captain. The throne room? The captain dropped Bartholomew to the ground. "I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment, Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. "Follow the black carpet," said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttering of voices behind heavy doors. He won't take off his hat. He won't take off his hat? No, he won't take off his hat. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in a long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne. Beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore in his belt, instead of a sword, a long silver ruler. Lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. How do you think the king was looking down at Bartholomew if he was looking down at him severely? How do you think the king's face looked? Yeah, you're right. I think that he looked angry. Yes, look at his face. Yes, he does look angry. And this is what he said. "Young man, I'll give you one more chance. Will you take off your hat for your king?" "Your Majesty," said Bartholomew as politely as he possibly could. "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." And he took off his hat, and he didn't do any good. Another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He took off hat after hat after hat after hat until he was standing in the middle of a great pile of hats. The lords and noblemen were so astonished they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. "Heavens," said Sir Alaric, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. "He's taken off 45. And there were 3 more down in the town," said the king. "And you must add on 87 more that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats. Most unusual," said Sir Alaric, writing it down on a long scroll. "Come, come," said the king impatiently. "Sir Alaric, what do you make of all this nonsense?" "Very serious nonsense, Your Majesty," answered Sir Alaric. "I advise you to call in an expert on the hats." "Excellent," agreed the king. "Ho, guard! Fetch in Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the fine lords." Okay, so we already met another interesting character. Who is this? Sir Alaric. And what is he doing in this picture? Yes, he is putting down tally marks, writing down tally marks for the hats that he's counting. And now we're going to meet another strange character, Sir Snips, maker of hats for all the noblemen and noblewomen. Into the throne room marched the smallest man wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. "Take a look at this boy's hat," commanded the king. Sir Snips looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly. "Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords. I make hats of cloth of gold, fine silks and gems and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It is the most ordinary hat I ever set eyes on." What do you think the word ordinary means? What did Sir Snips think of Bartholomew's hat? Yes, you were right. He thought that it was just plain, old, nothing special, and he was used to beautiful, magnificent hats. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take it off. Simple indeed, mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it to the floor. Immediately, another appeared on Bartholomew's head. "Screamies!" screamed Sir Snips, leaping in the air higher than he was tall. Then he turned and ran shrieking out of the throne room. Ah! Look at Sir Snips. He is terrified. Why do you think he's so terrified? Maybe he thinks it's black magic. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. Your Majesty, I advise that you call in your wise men. A fine idea, said the king. Ho, guard! Bring me Nad. Nad knows about everything in all my kingdom. In came an old man. He looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head. And he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nad, my wise man, can you take off his hat? Asked the king. Nad shook his head solemnly. Solemnly, no. Then fetch me the father of Nad, commanded the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom and in all the world beyond. In came an even older man, but when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. Then bring me the father of Nad, ordered the king. He knows about everything in all my kingdom, in all the world beyond, and in all other worlds that may happen to be. Then came the oldest man of them all, but he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. Does this mean there is no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew, it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out on the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. There's a boy in here, just about your age, the king said. He won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down. There stood a boy with a big lace collar, a very proud little boy with his nose in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfred, nephew of the king. You send him down here, said the Grand Duke Wilfred. I'll fix him. The king thought for a minute. He pushed back his crown and scratched his head. Well, maybe you can. There's no harm trying. Take him to the Grand Duke Wilfred, commanded the king, and two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. Pooh, said the Grand Duke Wilfrid, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meanly. That hat won't come off. You stand over there. He pointed to a corner where the wall curved out. I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow. When Bartholomew saw that the Grand Duke Wilfrid had only a child's bow, he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered Wilfrid, and he let fly an arrow. Zzz. It grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew and over the parapet. But another hat appeared on his head. Zzz, zzz, zzz. The arrows flew till the Grand Duke's whole bagful of arrows was gone, and still a hat sat upon Bartholomew's head. It's not fair, cried the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 154 hats, gulped Sir Alaric. These hats are driving me mad. The king's voice rang out through all the palace. Why waste time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm. Fetch me the yeoman of the bowmen. Yeoman of the bowmen, echoed all the lords and noblemen of the court. A gigantic man strode out across the terrace. His bow was as big as the branch of a tree. The arrow was twice as long as Bartholomew, and thicker than his wrist. Yeoman of the bowmen, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard that he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Grr-zib! Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow tore through the air and toward Bartholomew Cubbins. Grr-zap! The sharp arrowhead bit through his hat and carried it off on and on for a full half-mile. Grr-zop! It plunked to a stop in the heart of an oak tree. Yet there on Bartholomew's head sat another hat. The face of the yeoman of the bowmen went white as the palace walls. It's black magic! He shrieked. Hey, we are going to stop right here for today. Well, we did meet a lot of interesting characters, right? Sir Alaric, Sir Snips, and the Grand Duke Wilfrid, who might just be a very important character. And we met the yeoman of the bowmen, and even he could not take off Bartholomew's hat. So did Bartholomew solve his problem today? You're right. He still has the same problem. Tune in for day 3 of our reading, where we find out how Bartholomew Cubbins' problem is finally solved. See you later.